Good evening, everyone. Or good evening. I'm so sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyla Hannington. I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Chief with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our agency investigates complaints of civil rights discrimination. We combat human trafficking around the region. We ensure all people can access county government services in the language of their preference, and we create opportunities to build understanding across diverse peoples and for learning on social justice and human rights issues. With me today as co-hosts are Tiana Davis, the Outreach Specialist with the Office of Human Rights, and Dr. Audrey Lau, Adult and Senior Services Specialist with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. Lunch and Learn, a joint partnership between the Office of Human Rights and the library system, debuted this summer and has been a complete delight. We are honored to have been joined by such incredible guests, and today I'm very excited to introduce you now to Judge David Tatel. Judge Tatel served on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit from 1994 to 2024, succeeding future Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. After graduating from the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago Law School, he served as the founding director of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, and then director of the National Lawyers Committee. He headed the Office of Civil Rights for the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare during the Carter administration, and then founded and led the education practice at Hogan Lovells, where he is now senior counsel. Judge Tatel is a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in the past, he co-chaired the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Science, Technology, and Law, and chaired the boards of the Spencer Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Judge Tatel and his wife Edie live in Virginia and Washington, D.C. They have 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And it is an absolute pleasure and a thrill to have you with us today, Judge Tatel. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Good morning.
We have you here to talk about your book, Vision, a Memoir of Blindness and Justice, which is just a beautiful and incredible book. And I'm inspiring, and we'll talk more about that. But I'm hoping you can take a few minutes to introduce the viewers to the work.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'm delighted to be here to talk about the book. So maybe I just ought to develop a little bit more my biography, because that's what the book is really about. It's a memoir. So I was born in Washington, D.C., but I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, not far from where you are. I grew up in the 1940s and 50s, went to junior high and high school in Montgomery County. I went to Montgomery Blair High School. I was always, as a kid, my father was a scientist, and I was always interested in science. And when I went off to college at the University of Michigan, I went to be a scientist. That was going to be my plan. But it was the 1960s, and it was the middle of the civil rights movement and all the excitement and energy around that, the sit-ins, the freedom rides. And I got very interested in the civil rights movement. And the University of Michigan was, a place where there was demonstrations and lectures, and kind of a great time to be a college student and to get interested in the world around me. And I say that because after I was at Michigan for about a year, I kept up my science and math work, but I switched to political science because I decided I wanted to work on civil rights issues, and I thought the best way to do that was to become a lawyer. So I switched to political science, and then went on to the University of Chicago Law School. And from there, my career was mostly civil rights. As you heard from the introduction, I was the director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, an organization that was created in the 1960s at the request of President Kennedy. I also directed the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare during the Carter administration. And you've probably all noticed that today is Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday. And then after that, I went back to law practice, where I worked on education law and spent a huge amount of time all over the country representing school boards. In fact, I think I probably did either some work for the Prince George's school system, or actually I was part of the team from the Legal Defense Fund that sued the Prince George's school system in the desegregation case. And I worked on that case for quite a while. In 1994, as the introduction indicated, President Clinton appointed me to the U.S. Court of Appeals. I served there for 60 years and 30 years, and now I'm back as a senior counsel to my firm. While this was, throughout my career though, I was going through an interesting and difficult personal experience. When I was very little, I had trouble seeing at night. Nobody knew what the problem was. My parents took me to ophthalmologists, but they didn't know. And some people said, well, you know, it's dark at night, it's hard to see. But there were other indications that I had a problem. I tell the story in the book about one day I was on the ball field at our elementary school, and I got hit by a ball that I just didn't see coming. And even as a 12-year-old, I sensed something was wrong. When I was 15, my mother took me to the National Institutes of Health, where I was diagnosed with a incurable genetic eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa. At the time, they didn't know a whole lot about it. They did think that my sight would decline over time. They didn't know whether I would lose my sight or not. They just didn't know much about genetic. They didn't know much about genes, much less genetic eye diseases at the time. And sure enough, my sight did decline. I functioned pretty well. And I talk about this a lot in the book. I spent a lot of time as a young kid and as a young man covering up my blindness. Mm-hmm. I didn't talk about it. There were a lot of reasons for that, but you know, what kid wants to be different from his friends, right?
Right.
So, you know, I covered it up and I didn't talk about it. And then by the time I got to my mid-30s, I was the director of the Lawyers Committee. And by then, by the way, I had met and married my wife, Edie, and we had, at that time, two children, two daughters. And at that point, it became, I couldn't read anymore. My sight had declined to the point where I really couldn't read. And that's where I started the transition to functioning without sight. I used readers during that time. I learned Braille. Learned is an overstatement, but I tried to learn Braille. I began using aids to move around. Eventually, by my late 30s, I bit the bullet and got a white mobility cane. And even then, I didn't talk about it very much. I didn't want to be known as a blind person. I mean, by the time I got a cane, obviously everybody knew I was, but it wasn't something I talked about. And when President Clinton appointed me to the DC Circuit in 1994, his press release didn't say anything about it, although the press reported it as the first blind judge on a court of appeals. During the time I was on the court, I worked, I used all kinds of new technology, which we can talk about later if you'd like. And then at age 77, I finally got a guide dog. Her name is Vixen. And the last chapter of my book is called The Dog That Changed My Life. Mm-hmm. And that's not an overstatement. So this book is a memoir. And it's called a braided memoir because it's about the two threads of my life. It's about my life in the law and my life dealing with declining sight and ultimately becoming blind. And they're very interrelated threads. And I've tried to interrelate them throughout the book. And it's, as I said, it's a very deeply personal memoir, but it's also a memoir, not just about me, but about my now almost 60-year marriage to Edie, who, by the way, was for many years a school teacher, and our children. and our family. And it's as I said, it's a braided memoir, and I hope you have a chance to read it and that you like it.
Thank you so much for that introduction, which was fantastic. And the book really is wonderful. As I know, I emailed you earlier today talking about that. Like, it is just so rich and vibrant and hopeful, and also sort of scary, which we'll talk about, I hope, a little bit later on. I do want to talk about some of the scary bits. But I just really quickly, before I ask you a question, I want to let you know that there is some wonderful conversation already happening. And one of our viewers has shared, she writes that she knows that you're a Keats fan. And so she wanted to start with your interpretation of one of his quotes. Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school and intelligence and make it a soul? Of John Keats, Letters of John Keats. So do you want to talk a little bit about that one?
Actually, that's not a quote I'm familiar with. Read it to me once more.
Sure. Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul?
No, that's a very profound statement, and a beautiful statement. I think that a disability does help shape character. It's not necessary for shaping character, but I think a disability does affect character, obviously, and it affects character of people differently. In a way, I hadn't thought about it until you read me that beautiful passage, but in a way, that's sort of a description of my book, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a great quote. So thank you very much to our viewer for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Tiana or Audrey?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So your childhood was pretty wild to me. You grew up, your uncle was the inventor of Elmer's glue and hula hoops.
Right.
Your dad's telescope that he created found a black hole. You had a 2 month, what was it? Hold on. You left school for 2 months to do an expedition in Peru with your dad.
Yes.
So as a child, did you grow up with a lot of pressure to be great since you were surrounded by all of these like business owners and everything, or?
No, not at all. I bet here's a funny story, because I know there's probably a lot of teachers. So on the line, when my dad, I was a junior in high school when he took me to Peru with him on this expedition. And of course, they had to take me out of school. And the school thought that was a really bad idea for me not to be, instead of going on a scientific expedition with a group of really great scientists where I'd obviously learn a lot, they thought it was better that I stay home in Montgomery Blair and go to my English classes. It took a while to talk them into letting me go. But no, I didn't grow up under any pressure like that at all. My parents were wonderful parents, and they wanted myself and my sister to grow into what we wanted to be. Even though my dad was a scientist, he never pressured me to go into science. It was just seemed the natural thing for me to do. And in fact, I eventually left science and went into political science. So, I had a very idyllic upbringing in the 50s. Silver Spring was very quiet, suburban place, with lots of families, and also because of World War II and the large number of scientific institutions in and around Washington, a lot of the people we knew was scientists and engineers, which was really fun for a bunch of kids. I say in the book that, growing up in my neighborhood was like growing up in a science fair. There was all kinds of things going on.
Yeah, there was some great. I love the descriptions, like going from house to house and all the different experiments, or like rocket ships or whatever. That was fantastic. Yeah.
It was a really crazy place.
Oh wait! It's not your.
Go. You do
I'm gonna run. So whether you know that you don't know this, but two of the three of us have some ties to Mississippi, and
Oh,
one of my favorite Faulkner quotes is, "To understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi."
that's
And you
so
talk
important.
about how you've never forgotten your time there.
Yeah.
And you went to a place like Mississippi, and I went to a place like Mississippi for two very different reasons. I went because one of the professors Winthrop Jordan had won 2 Bancrofts, and I thought, well, if he can go to Mississippi, I can. I had no idea what to expect. But I guess the question I have is that call, the "Where are the lawyers?" Do you see that is as strong like as it is for lawyers today? And where do you see some of the more promising fronts of social justice in the United States? Is it still in places like Mississippi in the South, or do you think it's moved?
Well, the "Where are all the lawyers" quote that you mentioned is really important to this book. That's what Robert Kennedy said during the height of the civil rights movement in Mississippi and Alabama. He asked, "Where are all the lawyers? How come there aren't lawyers in the South working on these issues?" And if there's a thread, a third thread that runs through my memoir, it's that. It's my lifelong effort to be part of organizations and groups and myself to involve lawyers in civil rights work, make sure that the legal profession is carrying its share of responsibility to, as we say, make sure that everyone has access to the legal system and is well represented. Now, the other part of your question is very hard. Yeah, our country's made a lot of progress since the 1960s, but we still have a very long way to go. There's a story in yesterday's paper about the Justice Department's settlement with a little tiny town in Mississippi, where the police were abusing the citizens in so many ways. It reminded me of Mississippi in the 60s. So when you read something like that, you wonder, well, how much progress have we really made? But yeah, I mean, I don't have any doubt that things are better, but there's still a huge amount of progress, as we know from just look at all the efforts to suppress the vote. All you have to do is look at that, and you know that our country still has a long way to go.
I'm going to say, I hope someday, I hope I get to see it turn blue, but and I may not see that. But I got some chills when you talked about going to the courthouse in Oxford, and
yeah,
this is where I did my graduate degrees. And
so you went to Ole Miss?
I did.
Really? What year were you there?
I was there from 2010 to oh goodness. Or no, 2003 to 2013. Yeah. So 10 years. I did 10 years there.
It's a beautiful town. And it's a beautiful campus. But boy, does it have a history, right?
It does.
It does have a history. Yeah.
Yep. All right, Kyla, you're on.
All right. Well, you write about, and your career shows, this alignment and how there can be and maybe ought to be an alignment between business and civil rights. Like you talk about the hallmark and school desegregation,
right.
And between high-powered law firms and civil rights and government work. And yet, and you acknowledge this in the book, that this marriage or this connection would be unexpected or today. And I was just thinking, for those who haven't read it, could you take a little bit of time to go into both of those things I just referenced, if you don't mind, and how this intersection could work?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I mean, especially for me, because I mean, you've put your finger really on, the primary theme of this book, which goes back to Attorney General Kennedy's statement about where are all the lawyers. Mm-hmm. As a result of that question, his brother, the President of the United States, convened a meeting in the White House of 250 leaders of the American bar, the legal system, legal profession. And he asked them to create an organization that would bring the talents and prestige and skills of the legal profession to bear on civil rights issues. And the first thing the Lawyers Committee did was to send hundreds and hundreds of volunteer lawyers from law firms all over the country to Mississippi and Alabama to work on civil rights cases. We eventually opened up a big office in Jackson, which was a center of important civil rights litigation in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And then in the wake of the urban riots that swept the country in the late 60s, remember they began in Watts and they spread to Detroit and Chicago and New York and Washington. President Johnson created the Kerner Commission, which concluded with those famous words, "Our nation is headed towards two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal." And as a result of that, now President Johnson called on the Lawyers Committee to go national. That is to open up offices all around the country to help bring the prestige and skills of the bar to bear on problems in LA, Detroit, and Chicago. And they did. They opened up offices all around the country, including Chicago, which I ended up being the director of. And the Lawyers Committee is still thriving today. In fact, just about this time last year, we were at the White House where President Biden celebrated the 60th anniversary of both the Lawyers Committee and the March on Washington. And I talk about that in the book because that's where Vixen met the President of the United States, and I tell that story in the book. So that has been a theme of my book. That is trying to ensure that everyone has access to the legal system and structuring our legal profession in a way that increases the chance of happening. So yes, I've worked very hard to get law firms to do civil rights work. I have a chapter in the book about my efforts to help create the Legal Services Corporation, which funds legal services for poor people. So there's a lot of that in the book, and it's a very important part of my own career, including when I was a judge. I loved it when I had a case where one of the parties was represented by a legal aid lawyer. Or, for example, my court was the court that heard all of the cases from the detainees at Guantanamo Bay. And although they're some of the most despised people in our country, the 9/11 terrorists, they were represented by some of the best lawyers in our country who were working for free because of their belief that no matter who you are, no matter how unpopular you are, and no matter what kind of crime you might have committed, you are entitled to be heard in our legal system. And that's what I've worked on for 60 years.
And it's so, this is so critical. And maybe this is, as I read this, so on a personal level, so when I first came to the United States, I didn't have a work visa, but I volunteered. I volunteered at Indiana Legal Services.
Where did you come from?
Well, I moved from, I'm from Canada, but I moved from Denmark to Indiana. Yeah. So I came to Indiana the long way from Canada through Denmark. And I volunteered at Indiana Legal Services for a couple of years, actually.
Really?
And so it was awesome. And so getting to have that experience, and I worked, about part-time, 2 to 3 days a week as an attorney assistant. And so had to have, obviously it's on a volunteer basis, but getting to have that experience of what the work of legal services is and what it mattered, and to be able to kind of have touch that. And so reading your work and seeing that this was you're the man that I can thank for that. So let me take a moment and just it's huge, right? It's so huge what legal services does for people in this country.
Yes. Legal services. I am so committed to legal services. There are different kinds of legal services programs around the country, but they're all staffed with, vibrant, excited, committed lawyers who are trying to meet the legal needs of poor people. I think they're the people who excite me the most when I think about the law. I love what they're doing, and I was so honored to play a small part in that whole movement.
Yeah. Well, it is really incredible. And so for people, watching, listening today, if you're not familiar with the work of legal services, I mean, Judge Tatel there's a lot in the book where you can learn about it, but also just getting to know your local legal services, finding out what they're doing, finding out how you can support them, whether volunteering or financially. Like, I really suggest it because it's incredible what people go through and what legal services offers. I did want to talk. I'm going to ask one more thing, and I'm going to hand it back to Audrey and Tiana. But as we're talking about this commitment and this relationship between the law and social justice and civil rights, like, one of the things for me, and I said in the beginning that there was some really scary parts for me reading this, and you have a whole chapter in your book called "The Future of Democracy," and we here at the Office of Human Rights often talk about the connection between human rights and democracy. They are not separate. And so as you're writing about the erosion of voting rights and access to voting, and your decision to retire being somewhat influenced by essentially being frankly tired of having your work reviewed by a Supreme Court that seemed to hold in such low regard the principles to which you dedicated your life. And so I just kind of read that, my blood sort of ran cold. We're making it more and more difficult for people to vote. And I sometimes think that there are people who are actually kind of happy about that if they perceive the people who are cut off from voting as holding a different political opinion from them. And of course, diversity of political opinion is foundational to democracy. So what are the implications of all of that to all of us? Can you talk about those implications and what we can do about it?
Well, you alluded to the chapter. There's the last chapter in the book. That is the last chapter before you get to the chapter about Vixen, is called "The Future of Democracy," and it's about the voting rights cases because I can tell them from a personal point of view because I wrote opinions in those cases when I was on the DC Circuit. Both major voting rights cases, Northwest Austin and the famous Shelby County case, both of which were reversed by this Supreme Court. And what I talk about in that chapter is the threat to democracy, which I see in these Supreme Court decisions. And that threat's at two levels. The most obvious one is, as a result of the Supreme Court's Shelby County opinion, voter suppression efforts took off, particularly in the South. Mm-hmm. And southern states, southern voting districts, you can't pick up the newspapers today without finding several articles about different voting districts or states that are suppressing the vote in different ways throughout the South and also throughout parts of other parts of the country. And these efforts, most of these efforts could not have gone forward under the Voting Rights Act. But now that the Supreme Court has invalidated the most important provision of that act, it's called Section 5 preclearance. It required certain districts that had a history of discrimination on the basis of race in voting to submit any change in their voting procedures to the Justice Department for approval. That's now gone. Mm-hmm. And so states and voting districts are making changes that never would have passed the Voting Rights Act, but now are just being implemented. And the result is that they're making it more and more difficult for certain types of people to vote. So that's the obvious level at which it's a threat to democracy. But there's another equally important level, and that is that these Supreme Court decisions are deeply unprincipled. They're courts, they threaten the balance of power between the branches of government, the separation of powers, because they aren't faithful to the Constitution. They aren't faithful to the court's own precedent. And when you have a court, remember but I remember, what we all learned in 7th grade. There's 3 branches of government. 2 of them are elected. 1 is appointed. And the appointed one has enormous potential power over the elected branches. And what's preserved the separation of powers over the years is that the courts have restrained themselves. Well, this court is doing less and less of that, and is expanding its own power at the expense of the other 2 branches of government. That's dangerous for a democracy. So it's a double threat to democracy. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
That's what the last chapter of the book is about. And you said, well, what do we do about it? Well, I thought a lot about that as I was writing this. One of the great things about writing a memoir is you get to think about difficult questions. And I'm not a fan of structural changes in the court. I'm not a big fan of adding justices. I like the idea of term limits, but none of this is going to happen, because it either requires legislation that can't pass because of the filibuster, or it requires a constitutional amendment, which will never happen. So what can we do? Well, my conclusion in it is vote. Yeah. What else do we have? Yeah. We have the vote. And my last chapter is a plea to everybody to get everybody registered, get everybody voting. Vote, vote, and vote. And vote. Don't vote for a president if that president says, I'm going to appoint justices who will accomplish A, B, and C. You want to vote for a president who will appoint great judges. And also pay attention to Congress. Congress can check the president. Congress has enormous power to check the courts. But this Congress doesn't use that power. And so you want to vote for members of Congress who understand their role in the separation of powers and who can check the Supreme Court in its excessive behavior these days. So.
Right. And this is something like we have a series with the library system, Voting Democracy in Action, which is really about civic engagement. And so we also echo, involvement in whatever way you can, helping people register. Like, I love that. Thank you so much.
Get people registered, get them to the polls, just go to work, get everybody voting. And if they throw up barriers, which they're doing right all across the country, like if they require voter IDs or other things, go ahead and get the ID. Don't let them discourage you. Everybody needs to vote, even though they're throwing all kinds of barriers in your way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Audrey or Tiana. Thank you so much.
I had a question. So your doctor, Dr. Elliot Burson, he was the one who first diagnosed you with retinitis pigmentosa.
Yep.
He died somewhat recently. Were you
He
in
did.
touch with him throughout your life, just as he continued that research?
No, but I'm curious. Did you know him? Is that how you know this? Or did you just look
No.
it up?
I looked it up after I read about him in your book.
Yeah, he was at NIH for many years, and then he moved up to Massachusetts, to the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Clinic, which is another great place. And I did see him once or twice there, but I didn't stay in touch with him. I haven't seen him in probably 40 years. So, but he was a pioneer. He was one of the few doctors who understood this.
Yeah, and it seemed like he continued that research throughout his career.
Oh yeah, he was completely committed to this. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask a really, I guess, fun question. Your desire to listen to the Nats baseball games just really, really struck a chord. My dad and I used to listen to the Yankees as I was growing up in the backyard, and it didn't even occur to me that there might be a delay in any point in time. But your desire to listen to these baseball games and being able to vote on your own without assistance, which is a much bigger victory. Yeah. So much of your story hinges on the technology and people who helped you, large and small, navigate through your world. Help us to understand how we can be better listeners when it comes to those requests, because I was just blown away that the Nats listened. Like, and I mean, I'm a Yankees fan, but I mean, the Nats have just jumped up there in my estimation of a baseball team, because the fans are what make it, but at the same time, it's all about, everybody's experience. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, it took a while to get them to listen. Remember, I mean, it was they were not very responsive for a very long time. And if I hadn't accidentally met this member of the family at an event, it never would have happened. But I mean, maybe we should just tell the story for your listeners. Yeah, I'm a huge baseball fan. I love baseball. And when I went to a ball game, I would take along a portable radio so I could hear the, play-by-play. But when the Nats returned to Washington, I discovered that there was a 15-second delay. There are a lot of reasons the FCC gives for that, but whatever, they had a delay, which really did kind of destroy the excitement of being at the game. I would hear the crack of the bat, and not for 10 or 15 seconds would I know what happened. Sure, people could tell me about it, but that isn't what you want. That's not what I want. I want to do things myself. I don't want to have to depend on other people. And so I started writing letters to the Nats and didn't get anywhere. And finally, I ran into a member of the family at a moot court, and I told him about this. And the next day, I got a call from a vice president who said, whenever I'm going to the game, I should call him. He gave me a cell phone. He said he'll get the delay turned off, and that's what happened. I did that for quite a few years. Now, when you go to Nationals Park, you can buy a little ear set, goes on your ear. I think they cost maybe $12, and you can hear the play-by-play. So I take credit for all that. But the answer to your question is technology. That's technology is really important to me and to anybody else who's blind. Frankly, it's one of the reasons why I've been successful at what I do. It's because of technology. Here, I'll just give you one example. It's pretty dramatic. When I started at the DC Circuit, like all judges, I had 4 law clerks. But because I was blind, I also had an assistant who would read to me. And in my first few years on the book, that assistant read everything to me. Newspapers, memos, opinions, briefs, everything. Read all day long. In my last year, that person maybe read 5% to me, because I can read everything myself now. That once the world went digital, through text-to-speech technology, I have lots of devices that I can do all my reading myself now. So it's been a revolution, really, in the ability of blind people to function. This smartphone that I have here, I can do huge numbers of things just with this all by myself. I can read the morning papers. I can read books. I can do everything with this that I used to have to rely on other people for. But now I no longer do. Independence, that's the gold standard of accessibility. You want people to be able to do things themselves.
Well, and the fact that Vixen allows you to go through the metro just blew my mind. It was amazing. I just couldn't believe it. From your home to the door. I mean, we all know what metro is like. It's crazy. And I bet you were going at a normal time. Like,
oh yeah, rush hour. Yeah, Vixen didn't mind it. She's great on the metro. She takes me to the escalators. She stops to make sure I know we're there. She hops on. She loves these escalators. You can tell. She's looking around. Her ears are straight up. It's very cute. And she's very good on the subway. She's very reliable. She knows all about it. So I have a huge amount of independence with Vixen. And as I said before, independence is the key to the realm for people with disabilities. The more we can do by ourselves, the better.
We actually have a question from a viewer on that topic. Liz says, speaking of independence, I was hoping to hear more about navigating with the dog versus the cane.
Oh, well, everybody is different. Both the dog and the cane are navigational tools. And for some reason, for some people, the cane works best. For other people, the dog works best. You can never replace, you can't replace cane travel with dogs, and you can't replace dogs with canes. There's just too much variation among people. But I'm a sort of study, because I spent most of my life with a cane. Now I have a dog. I find the dog is more independent for me. With the cane, first of all, the cane got more and more difficult for me as the city got more complex. It was just harder for me to manage with my cane. A lot of blind people do just fine, but for me, it was a bit of a challenge.
Mhm.
The dog, Vixen, gives me a huge amount of independence. One of the things about using the cane is if you're walking down the street, blind people, when they're moving around, they're using hearing a lot. You use sounds for all kinds of things. You use sounds for oncoming traffic. You use sounds for knowing where you're standing in relationship to a building. You use all kinds of sounds, but the sounds in cities have gotten louder. There's construction sites, there's big trucks.
Mm.
And with a cane, you can feel lost. But that's not true with Vixen. Vixen doesn't care about those sounds. She just leads me right past them.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm going to share a couple more viewer questions, and then I'll hand it back to Tiana and Audrey. Denise is wondering if you could speak on Bold and Special Olympics and how Bold helped you with your competitive sporting.
Bold, you said?
Bold. Yeah.
B-O-L-D, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
B-O, all capitals, B-O-L.
No, sorry, you broke up while you were saying it.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, it wasn't you, it was the internet, I think. So there's a whole section, a whole couple paragraphs in the book about that. I used to be a big skier, and while I was losing my sight, skiing got harder and harder. And one day when Edie and I were skiing in Colorado, I really couldn't ski anymore. It was too hard, couldn't see. But she discovered this program called Bold Blind Outdoor Leisure Development. And a bunch of people in Aspen had developed this technique because they had a friend named Jean Emir. He was a French skier, and he lost his sight due to diabetes, which is, a major cause of blindness. And they didn't want him to stop skiing. So they developed a system of a guide skis behind him and calls the turns. I don't know how many of your listeners are skiers, but the person's behind you, and they tell you when to make a turn: left turn, right turn, straight, and you wear bibs, which tell people that you're a blind skier. And anyway, Edie found these people, and they started skiing with me, and within a week, I was skiing just as well as I had before, thanks to these people. Now there's Bold programs. I don't know that they call them Bold, but they're at all ski resorts because the Americans Disabilities Act requires that. So there are lots of accessibility programs at ski resorts for blind people, and they're great. They get people. It's not just blind. People with, amputees can use these programs. They're really great programs because they get you out doing things you wouldn't otherwise think you could do.
I think it must take so much courage. When I was reading this section about you skiing and with someone that you hadn't met before, who's just like left, how much trust and courage that you had to just do it, to just turn left.
Yep, it takes a lot of guts. My wife just reminds me over here. But here's the really fun thing: for the last 5 or 6 years of my skiing, my go-to guides were two of my kids. Mm-hmm. My two younger kids were great skiers, and they became my guides, which was really quite extraordinary. I put my life in the hands of those two young people, and and they were guiding their father down these slopes. It was quite wonderful. But they now have their own kids. They're busy. I've stopped skiing. It's just I've gone on to other things.
I'm going to ask one more question from one of our viewers, and then again, I'll go to Audrey and Tiana. So Denise is wondering, can you speak more on Be My Eyes, Be My AI?
Sure. You're talking about technology now. And technology, it's a lot easier to be blind now than it was 50 years ago, now that everything's gone digital and we have the internet. So Be My Eyes is this wonderful service. I have the app on my iPhone. I open it up. So, like, for example, when I take Vixen out for a walk at night, if I'm not sure her collar light is on, you know, she's got one of those cool collar lights because, you know, she's dark and I want the drivers to see her. So if I'm not sure whether her light's on, I open up my Be My Eyes app and I hit call an agent, it says. And within about 10, 15 seconds, somebody says, hello, may I help you? And they're looking through your camera on your phone. So I point the camera at Vixen and I say, so is her light on or off? And they say, oh, it's off. You better turn it on. So I hit the button and then I say, is it on? They say, yep. And I say, I want it to blink. Let me try it again. And she said, okay, it's blinking. So that's what Be My Eyes is. They have 1 million volunteers around the world who do this sort of thing. And you use them for all kinds of things. You know, if you can't find your sock, you drop your sock. Or, you know, if you're opening up the mail and you want to sort out your mail, you can use Be My Eyes. They're all volunteers. They're all quite wonderful. There's other programs like that. There's one called IRA that I've just started using, AIRA, which has, it's much more sophisticated and it's not free. It costs money. But IRA it also has an app on the phone, and one of their agents can help you write emails, make airline reservations. It's really great.
That is pretty cool. Sorry?
A lot of services now that didn't exist 30 years ago.
We did a program with the library a few years ago with the director for the library for the blind and print disabled.
Yeah, National Library. Yeah.
And that was a wonderful program, but it really inspired me because it was also talking about volunteer readers of books that you could be. And so as you're talking about, and I reading it and then hearing you talk now about the volunteer readers or volunteers who tell you what to help you find what you're looking for. Like that seems like a wonderful opportunity for those of us who are sighted to get involved and do some volunteering. This is great.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right. Let me just say, so the Library of Congress program, those readers are not volunteers. The Library of Congress has hundreds of thousands of recorded books, and the people who record them are actors, actresses, and they're great. I started using them in the 70s. They go all the way back to the New Deal. They're quite wonderful. But there are other programs like Learning Ally that really does need volunteer readers. They do more textbooks and things like that for students. And they are always in need of volunteer readers. It's a great thing people can do.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in there real quick as the librarian in this conversation that the Maryland Library for the Blind and Print Disabled, I put the link in the chat. But that you can go to their website and you can either call or you can write to them. They're very, very responsive. But that's basically anyone who has not only blind, but it has like an ability to hold a book, which I thought was really fascinating. But they're just such a wonderful group of people. When I worked in the Prince George's County Correctional Center for 9 years, we would put in an application, and within the week we would have Braille books or whatever we needed to our facility. So they really are great and responsive. So go ahead, Tiana, if you have a question.
I do. I wanted to ask about sort of what was driving your fear of people finding out about your blindness, especially since like as your kids were growing up, they were okay with it, and they did, like when they went to their friends' houses, you know, they were like, oh, well, this is our normal. Like, I don't know, things didn't, I don't want to phrase this incorrectly, but things didn't seem so scary. And so I was wondering what was driving the fear.
Well, the different phases of the situation. When I was really young, you know, a teenager or even in college, you know, as I said, I think most people don't want to be different. And I didn't have to tell people I had this eye disease. And I suppose there was a little bit of embarrassment in it also. And as I got older, I worried that it would hurt me professionally. I mean, that's what I think as I look back. You know, the interesting thing about this book, one of the many interesting things about this book, is that since it's published, I get 2 or 3 emails a day now from people who I don't know, who say to me, you've told my story. So suddenly now, after all these years, I'm discovering that I wasn't the only one doing this. That lots of people struggling with visual disabilities and declining sight did exactly what I did. And not just people with disabilities, other kinds of disabilities. It's been really quite fascinating for me to discover this. Because, you know, when I was going through it, I thought it was just me. I didn't have anybody to talk to. I thought it was just me. But now suddenly I discover after all these years, and I never would have known this had I not written the book. Now I know there's all these people out there who all say, gosh, I did the same thing. I mean, there's emails, people tell me that, who I meet. Yeah, they say, oh, I really liked your book. By the way, you told my story. I did the same thing you did. You know, I told a story about how when I was a kid, we'd go to the movies. I couldn't see at night. I couldn't see in the dark. So I developed a system to get popcorn. You know, I'd count the seats down to the aisle and then count the rows back up and then count backwards. And I've had several people who said, gee, I did the same thing. So it's quite a revelation, I have to say.
If no one else has any more questions, I'm going to jump to questions about Vixen. She was in the
Vixen,
background
I was
for a little
wondering when
bit.
you'd get to Vixen.
Yeah. So, how old was she when you got her? Like, can you talk
She
to us
was
about
2.
Vixen? 2.
Yeah. Yeah. Guide dog programs, there's a couple dozen in the country. They just do great work. And they all have pretty much the same model. The puppies live with families until they're 1.5. And the families socialize the puppies and do basic training. But not guide dog training, just dog training. And they have many different kinds of families who do this. You know, families with children, family without children, families who live in cities, families who live in the country, all kinds. Because they want the dogs to get used to living in different kinds of places. And so when they're 1.5, they go back to the kennel and they have 6 months of intensive training where they learn to be guide dogs. The training is so extensive that only half the dogs that start end up being guide dogs. The rest become other kinds of dogs, service dogs, you know, bomb dogs or support dogs. But to be a guide dog, for example, you can't chase squirrels. That's not good to be a guide dog. Or you can't chase your tail. We found a dog that dropped out because he wouldn't stop chasing his tail. So when they're 2, they get connected to a human, and that's when I got Vixen. She was 2 years old, and she was extensively trained. And then the program where Vixen comes from is called Fidelco Guide Dog Foundation in Connecticut, and they're a unique one because they bring the dog to you and train you in your neighborhood. The other programs have facilities where you go stay for a month to learn to use a dog. But I picked Fidelco because I wasn't going to be able to go away for a month to learn to use a dog. And besides, it just made sense to me that you would learn where you live. And so that's what happened. This 4 or 5 years ago, this man shows up in a big truck with and out hops this beautiful German Shepherd guide dog. And I had 2 weeks of intensive training, and then he left and I was on my own, and Vixen and I are pretty good at it. You know, she's given me I like to say, I explain this in the book, she's given me this enormous amount of independence. My wife and I, we live in the country and we both love to walk, but I always had to go, whenever I wanted to go for a walk, I had to get my wife to go for a walk. She likes to walk, but she doesn't want to go for a walk all the time. Now, Vixen and I go for a walk. And it's along sometimes, but she doesn't have to. And we were talking earlier about going back and forth to work on the metro. Vixen does all of that. She's pretty remarkable what she can do.
I mean, everybody loves Vixen. Like, I think that's kind of like, I got that from your book too, with the sign on your desk saying, ask me about my dog.
Right.
We're getting pretty close to time. And I wanted to kind of close with a question. You write about hiding your blindness, and you say at one point in the book, you write, I also misunderstood what diversity is really about. I wasn't a judge who was just like everyone else. And the life experience born from my blindness were valuable, not shameful. And that is so important. And it's so key, like that who we are, like what makes us who we are is so relevant to all that we do. And I was wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit more about what diversity means and why it is such a celebration.
Well, just take my own. It's so much easier, to talk about your own experience. So when I was growing up, when you read my book, those of you who read it, you'll see how important role models were to me, lawyers, judges. But there weren't any blind lawyers or judges who could be role models. I didn't have any people like that, which is maybe one of the reasons why I kept it secret, because I didn't have any role models. Well, now there's more. There are more blind lawyers now and blind judges around the country, and now we have my book, and maybe this diversity, that is having a blind lawyer on the Court of Appeals, will help inspire other people that they can do the same thing. Same thing with Black lawyers and women lawyers. I know from my friends in the civil rights movement and, our women friends, how important it is for them to have these role models. Before I went on the DC Circuit, President Carter appointed the first woman, Patricia Wald, the first woman to the court. And that was so inspirational to a whole generation of young women. I mean, that's the argument for diversity in the courts, I think. And the courts are far more diverse than they used to be. It's actually quite tragic. There's still a long way to go, but the diversity, I think, is really important for that purpose. That's its primary objective that I think of.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we are out of time. There has been so much wonderful conversation in the chat, people thanking you, people talking about what they've learned from their roles or having disabilities in their jobs and how that's impacted them. So thank you.
Well, let me just say, can I just say one more thing about the book?
Please.
I wrote this book for many reasons, to be inspirational, to tell my story, but I also hope that people who are not disabled will read this book. People who, for example, in school systems or law firms who hire people, I hope that they'll read this book, and that they'll understand that people with disabilities, blind people, whatever, can succeed at the highest levels. That's why I love the Tim Shriver quote on the book, that head of the Special Olympics. I really like that quote on the cover of the book. And so I hope that the leadership of the Prince George's school system will look at this, read this book, and that when they're hiring teachers or administrators, and when they have 2 or 3 candidates and one of them happens to have a disability, they just hire on the basis of the merits, because with the right kind of support, people with disabilities can do just fine. That's what I hope this book will do.
Thank you. Thank you for it and for highlighting that.
Okay.
It really is a wonderful book. So for those of you watching, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, we really encourage you to get it. You can get it from your favorite independent bookstore. If you're wondering about one to use, Politics and Prose in DC is fantastic, and we, encourage you to check it out there. We know that his book is there, and you can also take it out from your library system, including our friends and the co-host for today, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. Our Lunch and Learn continues next week. We have Ben Eagerman coming to discuss Maryland's LGBTQ plus history with us. We have a lot of other great programs, including next Wednesday, we're talking to Dr. Pauline Caldas about her book, The Measure of Distance, which is going to be at 7 p.m. And you can learn more about our upcoming events by going to civilrights.mypgc.us. And please take out the time to check out what our friends, the library, are doing. They have many, many, many events every single day. And you can visit them at pgcmls.info/events. Judge Tatel, this has been amazing. I loved your book so much. We could talk to you for another hour for sure, but we appreciate you, all the work that you've done for our country, actually, and
Well,
for,
thank you.
you know,
Thank you. I love your enthusiasm about the book.
oh,
Thank
it really is so
And-
good. Like, I'm not joking when I'm like, I kept reading it. I was like, oh my gosh, like I'll be honest, I didn't know so much about you. And so reading how much you had done sort of like for so many years in all these areas that intersect with our personal lives and our work.
Yeah.
And it was just phenomenal. It's a wonderful read. So thank you.
Thank you. And I should just add that for your listeners who are blind or have visual disabilities, there's a great audio version of the book, and it's free from the National Library Service. And the real treat is that, I do the prologue and the acknowledgments, and a friend of mine reads the book. But at the end, if you get all the way to the end, Vixen plays a role.
Oh, all right.
Very cool. Very cool.
All right. Thank you. This was
Thank you so
lovely.
much.
I liked your questions. They were great. Thank you.